The small town of East Hollow was quiet, too quiet, a place where the days passed like the pages of a dusty book, barely noticed by the world outside. People came and went, but the town always stayed the same. The streets were lined with cobblestone. The houses stood like sentinels and the air smelled of old wood and the crisp scent of autumn. But it was the hill at the edge of town, the one that loomed over East Hollow, that drew the most attention. On top of that hill sat the church. James had always been intrigued by the old church. He'd seen it from the town's streets since he was a child, its spire piercing the sky like a forgotten monument. The building stood tall, dark, and mysterious, a constant reminder of the town's past. It had burned down years ago, but it was still there, its shell crumbling away as time gnawed at its structure. "Are you sure about this?" Nina asked, her voice cutting through the crisp air. She tucked her hands into her jacket pockets and looked up at the church. The moon cast an eerie light on its shattered windows, the church's silhouette standing against the night sky like an omen. James, the leader of the group, grinned. His confidence was unwavering. "It's just an old building. Nina, nothing spooky about it, we're just going to take a look inside." "I don't know," Nina said, her voice hesitant. "The place is cursed. Everyone in town knows that. People used to tell stories about it. They say it was a site of rituals. They say there's something evil about it." "That's just old gossip," James said with a scoff. "Ghost stories. I don't believe in that stuff. Do you, Aaron?" He turned to his friend Aaron, who had been silent so far. Aaron chuckled. "I don't believe in ghosts. It's all just a bunch of nonsense. But hey, let's see for ourselves. I'm down for an adventure." Kara, who had been quiet, rolled her eyes. "I'm in for the thrill, but I'm not here for a seance or whatever you guys are planning. Let's just go, look around, and get out before midnight." Ben, the youngest of the group, was practically bouncing with excitement. He had been looking forward to this moment all week. "Let's go. We're going to prove that nothing's wrong with this place. The old church is just old. Simple as that." The 5 friends, all in their late teens, began their trek up the hill toward the church. The air grew colder as they walked, the wind picking up, making the leaves rustle and whip around them. The higher they climbed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the earth itself was warning them to turn back. But they didn't. They were determined to see what lay inside. At the top of the hill, they reached the church. The towering structure loomed over them, its spire like a finger pointing toward the heavens. The heavy wooden doors of the church creaked slightly in the wind, almost as if inviting them in. James pushed the door open. It groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the air like a warning. Inside, the church was cold, dark, and musty. The stench of rot and decay lingered in the air, mixing with the smell of damp stone and dust. Broken stained glass windows lined the walls, their colors faded and cracked. The pews were scattered haphazardly. Some collapsed, some overturned, all covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. "Man, this place is a dump," Aaron said, walking in and shining his flashlight around. "How do you think it burned down?" James shrugged. "Who knows, maybe it was lightning or something." "I'm telling you, there's something wrong here," Nina muttered, looking around nervously. "I don't like it." James ignored her, stepping further into the church. "You guys are just scared of a few broken windows and some dust. Come on, let's explore." They split up to explore the different sections of the church. James and Aaron went toward the altar, while Nina, Kara, and Ben stayed in the back near the pews. The air was cold, and the silence was unnerving. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the vast emptiness. Every now and then, they heard a creak or a groan, as if the building itself was alive, shifting in the darkness. "I don't feel right about this," Nina said, shivering. "Let's just go back." "Not yet," James replied, his voice firm. "We haven't even seen the crypt yet." "Crypt?" Kara raised an eyebrow. "There's a crypt?" James nodded, a mischievous grin on his face. "Yeah, I heard about it from some of the older people in town. They said there's a hidden door behind the altar that leads down to it. We should check it out." The group exchanged uneasy glances. But despite the unsettling feeling in the air, they followed James toward the altar. As they passed the stained glass windows, the wind seemed to pick up, howling through the cracks and making the light flicker. James reached the altar and began pulling at the old stone, trying to find the hidden door. "I knew it was here," James muttered, pushing aside some debris. Beneath the altar, a small trapdoor was revealed. He grinned, triumphant. "See? I told you guys." Ben looked down at the trapdoor, excitement dancing in his eyes. "Let's open it." Without waiting for anyone else's approval, Ben dropped to his knees and tugged at the door. It creaked and groaned as it opened, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into the darkness below. "Are you crazy?" Nina whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if there's something down there, something—" But before she could finish, Ben was already halfway down the stairs. "Come on, you guys are too scared." James followed him, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "I'll go first, you guys stay up here." The rest of the group hesitated, but Aaron, being the skeptic, followed without hesitation. Kara, with a sigh, reluctantly followed them down the stairs, leaving Nina alone at the top. She shivered, glancing around nervously. She felt the cold press of dread in her chest, and something deep within her told her to leave, to turn around and never come back. But she didn't. She stayed, drawn by the pull of curiosity. As the groups descended the narrow stone stairs, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew thick with a damp, musty scent. The staircase seemed to stretch endlessly downward, and each step creaked under their weight, sending echoes through the silence. The light from their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Do you guys feel that?" Kara asked, her voice trembling. James ignored her. "It's just the old stone and dust. Nothing to be afraid of." But even his words felt hollow. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls were damp with condensation, and the narrow staircase seemed to close in around them. It felt as if the air itself was becoming heavier, as if they were being pulled deeper into the earth. At last, they reached the bottom. The stone floor was cold and uneven, and their flashlights illuminated the dark space. The basement was larger than they expected, with low ceilings supported by rotting wooden beams. The walls were covered in thick layers of moss and mildew, and the flickering lights revealed strange markings scrawled across the stone. "This place feels wrong," Nina said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her anxiety was palpable, and it was clear that her earlier misgivings were growing stronger with every passing second. Aaron, ever the skeptic, laughed nervously. "It's just some old symbols, nothing creepy about it." Ben, who had been leading the group, turned toward the far wall, where a small wooden door stood half open. It was hidden in the shadows, its wood dark and weathered, as though it had been untouched for centuries. "That's it," he said, excitement creeping into his voice. "This must be the crypt." James and Aaron exchanged glances, both of them curious and eager to see what lay beyond the door. Kara, however, hesitated. "Are you sure we should be doing this?" she asked, her voice tight with unease. But James had already stepped forward, his hand on the handle. The door creaked open with an almost unnatural slowness, revealing a narrow hallway that stretched deeper into the church's bowels. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay hung heavy in the air. Without a second thought, James stepped into the hallway. "Come on, let's go." One by one, they followed him. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, winding through the stone like a maze. The deeper they went, the darker it became, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. The walls were covered in more strange symbols, but these were different, twisted, disturbing, as though they were meant to ward off something far more sinister than mere rats or pests. Finally, they came to a small chamber. The walls were lined with niches, each containing a small, dust-covered skeleton. Some of the bones had fallen out of their resting places, scattered across the floor in eerie disarray. The air in the room was thick and suffocating, as though It had been trapped in this place for centuries. "This is where it all went wrong," Nina whispered, her voice trembling with fear. She had a feeling, a gut instinct, that this place was far more than just an old crypt. James, however, was grinning. "This is amazing. This place is a relic, something no one's seen in years." Ben moved closer to one of the niches, peering. Sighed. He reached out, touching one of the skulls with trembling fingers. The moment he did, there was a sudden, bone-chilling sound, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a cold wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing their flashlights. "What the hell was that?" Aaron shouted, his voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, the walls of the crypt seemed to shift. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and the skeletal remains in the niches rattled as if being disturbed by an unseen force. The air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and the faintest whisper echoed through the chamber, incomprehensible yet full of malice. The door behind them slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside. "James!" Nina screamed, her voice rising with panic. "We need to get out of here!" But James, his face pale, stood frozen in place. His eyes were wide, his mouth trembling. He had heard it too, the whispers, the voices. Something was awakening. Something that had been buried in this place for far too long. "What's happening?" Kara asked, her voice barely audible. The ground beneath their feet shook again, harder this time. The crypt's walls seemed to pulse and the darkness grew oppressive, swallowing their surroundings. Shadows moved along the edges of the room, darting just out of the corner of their vision. There was a sudden, sharp sound, like something scraping against stone, and then a figure materialized from the darkness. A tall, gaunt figure, its face hidden beneath a hooded cloak. Its hands were skeletal, fingers long and twisted. It floated just above the ground, its body shifting as though made of smoke and shadows. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. "What is that?" Aaron gasped, his voice shaking with fear. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its voice, when it spoke, was like the grinding of ancient stone. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice like a hiss. "The church calls for its payment, and you are its payment." The temperature in the room dropped even further. The skeletal remains in the niches rattled once more, and suddenly the bones began to rise, floating into the air like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. The figures of the long-dead priests and worshippers began to reassemble, their skeletal forms standing upright, as if brought back to life. "Run!" James shouted, breaking free from his stupor. He turned and bolted toward the door, but the figure raised its hand and the door slammed shut once more, trapping them in the chamber. "We're going to die!" Nina screamed, her voice rising with terror. Ben, panicking, began to back away, his eyes wild. This is too much. We need to leave, now!" But the shadows closed in around them, and the figure spoke again, its voice a chilling echo that reverberated through the crypt. "The price for your curiosity is death. The church will have its due." The shadows pressed closer, their whispers growing louder, more desperate. The air was thick with the weight of centuries of forgotten rituals, and the walls seemed to pulse with the energy of something ancient, something dark. The church had waited for years, and now it had claimed its prize. The shadows pressed in tighter, their whispering voices now a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs, as though the very walls were alive, suffocating them with an ancient, unfathomable presence. The temperature had dropped to the point where their breath misted in the air, and every exhale felt like it could freeze their lungs. "Stay close," James shouted, his voice shaking. He looked frantically around for an escape, but the walls seemed to close in on them, trapping them within this twisted underground world. Nina grabbed Kara's hand, her knuckles white, as she frantically scanned the crypt. "This isn't real. It can't be real." Aaron, his face pale with terror, backed toward the far wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What do we do?" he choked out. "There's no way out." The ghostly figure at the center of the room, the tall, cloaked being, floated motionless. watching them with unseen eyes. Its bony fingers extended, reaching toward the air as if it was sensing something far beyond their comprehension. "Your souls are mine," the figure intoned, its voice like a whisper in the void, a voice that seemed to emanate from every corner of the room at once. Nina trembled. "Please stop, we didn't mean any harm. We just—" But the figure's form began to blur, twisting and distorting like smoke caught in an unearthly wind. The air around them grew thick with an oppressive force, and the whispers became louder, no longer distant but right beside their ears. The crypt seemed to be alive, its walls creaking and groaning as if it were an ancient creature waking from a long slumber. Ben, his fear now fully taking hold, lunged at the door, slamming his shoulder against it, desperate to break free. But it was no use. The door was sealed shut by some malevolent force. He pounded it again and again, his fists bruising from the impact. "Let us out!" he screamed, but the shadows only seemed to grow in strength, tightening around them like a vice. The figure spoke once more, its voice now echoing in their minds. "You cannot leave. The price has been set. The pact was made long ago." James fell to his knees, his breath ragged. "What pact? What are you talking about?" The figure's form stretched and swirled, its shape becoming less human and more like a mass of shifting darkness. Its voice, now filled with malice, responded. "The church was built on blood. Many years ago, a group of worshippers made a bargain with the spirits of the land. In exchange for power, they vowed to offer sacrifices to the Ancient Ones. Their souls were bound here, and yours are the next to join them." The air grew colder still, and the ground beneath them began to shake. Kara stumbled backward, her legs failing her as she collapsed to the floor. We're not going to survive this," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The figure moved toward her, and as it did, the skeletal forms of the priests and worshippers began to stir. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Each of them raised their hands in unison, chanting words in a language long forgotten, their voices joining the whispers that filled the crypt. "We need to—" "Stop this!" Ben yelled, his voice desperate. "There has to be something we can do." But Nina's eyes widened as she noticed something in the corner of the room. It was a stone altar, old and covered in centuries of dust. In its center, a strange symbol was carved, a symbol that looked disturbingly familiar. She had seen it before, back at the entrance of the church. "The symbol," Nina whispered, realization dawning on her. "It's connected to the pact." The ritual. The figure's hollow eyes locked onto her. "You are too late. The ritual cannot be undone." But Nina, desperate for a solution, reached into her bag. Her hand closed around the small vial of holy water she had brought with her, something her grandmother had insisted she carry whenever she went to places like this. She had never truly believed in its power, but now, in the face of unimaginable terror, it was all she had left. With trembling hands, she uncorked the vial, spilling a few drops onto the floor. The moment the water touched the stone, a blinding flash of light erupted from the altar, and the figure screeched, its form writhing in agony. The shadows around them recoiled, as if the very presence of the holy water was burning them. "The church will not fall so easily," the figure howled, its voice now filled with fury. But the altar was reacting to the water, its symbol beginning to glow with an eerie, pulsing light. The spirits of the dead began to howl, their forms writhing, in pain as the power of the ritual began to unravel. The walls of the crypt groaned, and for a moment it felt as if the entire church was coming to life. "Get to the altar," Nina screamed. "It's the only way." With newfound urgency, the group scrambled toward the altar, ignoring the shuddering walls and the disembodied whispers that surrounded them. As they reached it, Nina poured the rest of the holy water over the symbol, chanting the words her grandmother had taught her, words of protection, words of purification. The shadows shrieked, the figure twisting and writhing in agony as the power of the church began to crumble. The skeletal figures fell to the ground, their bones rattling as they disintegrated into dust. The walls cracked and split, and the crypt began to collapse around them. "Move!" James shouted, grabbing Kara's arm and pulling her toward the altar. The ground beneath them cracked open, and dust filled the air. The figure let out one final, blood-curdling scream before it was consumed by the light, its form shattering into 1,000 pieces of darkness that vanished into nothingness. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long time, no one moved. The cold that had gripped the crypt had dissipated, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The chamber was now eerily still, the oppressive presence of the dark figure gone. But the damage to the church was evident. The crypt had been torn apart, the walls cracked and crumbling. The altar, where the ancient ritual had been interrupted, was now nothing but a pile of rubble. James looked around, his heart still pounding in his chest. Did we do it?" he asked, his voice shaky. Nina nodded slowly, still in shock. I think we stopped it." Aaron, who had been silent the whole time, looked around nervously. "We need to get out of here. Now." The group stumbled back toward the stairs, the remnants of the church's once proud structure looming behind them. As they reached the top, the door that had once been sealed was now wide open, as if the church itself had finally released them. They didn't look back as they fled from the ruins, the echoes of the spirit still lingering in the air. The old church was no more. Its evil had been eradicated, its dark history finally coming to an end. But the horrors they had witnessed would stay with them forever. And deep in the shadows of the world, other forgotten places still waited. There, secrets buried, their packs undisturbed, at least for now.